He was the man every camera loved. Yet one day, he quietly disappeared from the glittering world that made him a legend. Before we uncover the truth behind why one of Hollywood's most magnetic stars vanished from the spotlight, make sure to subscribe for more in-depth stories of cinema's most mysterious icons and the lives they left behind. This is the story of a man who rose from humble beginnings to become the ultimate symbol of grace and romantic allure, only to step away when the applause was loudest. His name became synonymous with timeless charm, yet what happened behind the curtain tells a story far more human, fragile, and profound. Richard Gere's beginnings were far from the glamour that would one day define him. Born in 1949 in Philadelphia, he grew up in a disciplined, middle-class household where hard work and humility were expected, not optional. His father worked in insurance, his mother was a homemaker, and together they raised their children with strong values of respect and restraint. Gere was not the rebellious prodigy many expect of future stars. He was thoughtful, athletic, musical, and deeply introspective, a young man who excelled both on the playing field and in the quiet corners of his imagination. In high school, he played the trumpet and wrote music. At the University of Massachusetts, he studied philosophy before the pull of art became too strong to ignore. The decision to leave college and chase something uncertain would define not only his career, but his entire life philosophy. Trust your instinct, even when the path ahead is unclear. When Gere stepped onto the stage, something clicked. The theater gave him freedom, structure, and a sense of belonging that classrooms never could. He trained in regional productions before landing a role in the musical Grease, where his charisma immediately set him apart. Yet it was his performance in the play Bent, a story that demanded emotional vulnerability and unflinching honesty, that hinted at what was to come. Critics saw in him what audiences would later feel on screen, a quiet intensity that didn't need to shout to command attention. Unlike other actors of his generation who relied on bravado, Gere's magnetism came from something subtler, an inner life that flickered through his eyes. His move from stage to screen came naturally. Early film appearances in Days of Heaven and Looking for Mr. Goodbar revealed a man who could hold the camera's gaze without uttering a word. But it was American Gigolo in 1980 that changed everything. In that film, Gere wasn't just acting. He was redefining masculinity for an era. The sleek suits, the haunting solitude, the confidence that bordered on fragility. He embodied a new kind of Hollywood leading man, one who was sensual but soulful, beautiful yet broken. He became a cultural mirror, reflecting the shifting ideals of love, power, and identity in America. By the time An Officer and a Gentleman arrived in 1982, Gere had crossed the threshold from promising actor to full-fledged star. That film didn't just make audiences swoon. It made them believe in redemption, in transformation, in the idea that even a man hardened by life could still find tenderness. Then came Pretty Woman in 1990, the film that immortalized him as the ultimate romantic lead. Opposite Julia Roberts, Gere played the businessman with a heart, the man who could buy anything except the feeling he truly wanted. It was the role that turned him into an icon, a figure of sophistication and longing who seemed to walk out of a fairy tale and into real life. But behind that silver screen glow, the man himself remained enigmatic, distant, even misunderstood. What made Gere stand out was not just his talent, but his mystery. He was not a fixture at Hollywood parties. He rarely indulged in gossip or spectacle. While others courted attention, he quietly retreated, preserving a part of himself that fame could not touch. He often spoke about the dangers of celebrity, about how easily one's truth could be replaced by an image projected by others. In interviews, he would pause before answering, choosing his words like a poet rather than a performer. This restraint added to his allure, but also made him an outsider in an industry that thrived on constant exposure. Still, the fascination grew. His looks, his poise, and his intensity made him a media obsession, and soon his personal life became as discussed as his performances. Every photograph, every relationship, every appearance was scrutinized for meaning. Yet Gere seemed to move through it all with quiet indifference. To many, it looked like grace. To others, it was distance. In truth, It was survival. Fame had come fast, and he understood its fleeting nature better than most. He was never chasing attention. He was chasing understanding of himself, of others, of what it means to live with both light and shadow. By the early 1990s, Gere's name was synonymous with a particular kind of Hollywood myth: the gentleman lover, the moral romantic, the man who could break your heart without ever raising his voice. He carried an air of dignity that made audiences trust him, even when he played flawed characters. But that same dignity would later isolate him from the system that once celebrated him. The truth was, he didn't fit easily into Hollywood's expectations. He wasn't interested in the formulaic roles that made studios comfortable. He wanted meaning, depth, purpose. And when that search took him away from the spotlight, many wondered if he had lost his edge. In reality, he had simply outgrown the world that built him. The more he sought authenticity, the less he seemed to belong to Hollywood's machinery. His film choices became smaller, more introspective, more human. He wasn't chasing box office numbers anymore. He was searching for truth. But audiences still longed for the Richard Gere they remembered. The dashing hero, the elegant lover, the face that once filled movie posters across the world. What they didn't realize was that the man they were looking for no longer existed. Fame had given him everything and taken something crucial in return: anonymity, peace, and the quiet joy of ordinary living. Behind every photo shoot and red carpet smile, Gere carried questions that success could never answer. Who was he outside the characters he played? What was left when the applause faded? For most of Hollywood, those questions were dangerous. For Gere, they were necessary. His disappearance from the public eye wasn't a retreat, it was a reclamation. A man once defined by love stories on screen had finally chosen to live one in real life, with himself, with his beliefs, and with the stillness he had been chasing all along. He wasn't running from fame. He was walking toward freedom. And that quiet, deliberate step away from the spotlight would become the most defining role he ever played.
As his fame reached its highest point, the world was convinced Richard Gere had achieved everything an actor could dream of. He was a leading man, a global sex symbol, a red carpet fixture who could make audiences melt with a single glance. But behind the glossy magazine covers and box office triumphs, something deeper was stirring within him. Gere had always been introspective, someone who questioned not just the meaning of his roles, but the meaning of his own life. Success brought admiration, but it also brought loneliness, scrutiny, and the constant pressure to live up to a fantasy that wasn't real. To the world, he was a romantic hero. To himself, he was a man still searching for truth. Long before the cameras found him, Gere's sense of self had been built on discipline and introspection. His childhood in a modest Philadelphia suburb was defined by structure and humility, values that clashed with the chaos of celebrity life. Even as he graced the covers of Vanity Fair and GQ, he still spoke like a small-town kid, trying to make sense of a world that rewarded artifice over authenticity. His family remained grounded, and their quiet, steady presence became his anchor. He often spoke fondly of his parents' kindness and moral clarity, contrasting it with the glittering illusions of Hollywood. That grounding became vital in the years when fame threatened to swallow him whole. But Gere's relationship with Hollywood was never simple. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he never fully bought into the mythology of stardom. He saw acting as a craft, not a lifestyle. For him, every role was a meditation on human nature, an exploration of vulnerability and longing. That attitude gave his characters a rare emotional honesty. In Days of Heaven, his silence spoke louder than dialogue. In American Gigolo, his elegance masked a haunting emptiness. In An Officer and a Gentleman, he balanced power and tenderness in a way that felt almost spiritual. And in Pretty Woman, he perfected the paradox, playing a man who had everything yet still felt incomplete. By the early 1990s, he was one of the most recognizable faces on Earth. Yet for all the success, Gere remained an enigma. He was not a man who sought validation through attention. Fame seemed to sit on him awkwardly, like a costume he wore for work but removed in private. Those who knew him well often described him as quiet, observant, and surprisingly shy. He was polite, but not performative. He avoided confrontation, avoided gossip, and rarely indulged in the excess that surrounded him. To some, this made him seem aloof. To others, it was proof of his integrity. The truth lay somewhere in between. Gere simply didn't know how to exist comfortably in a world that demanded he constantly prove himself. And then came the relentless focus on his personal life. Hollywood had always been fascinated with his romantic mystique, and the press treated his relationships as extensions of his movie roles. His dating history read like a list of fascinating, powerful women, each relationship dissected and speculated upon. His partnership with the Brazilian painter Sylvia Martins lasted years and introduced him to a world of art and introspection that complemented his own temperament. It was his marriage to Cindy Crawford that turned him into tabloid royalty. They were the golden couple of the early 1990s, he, the elegant film star, and she, the supermodel at the height of her fame. Together, they embodied glamour, youth, and sophistication. But behind the perfect photographs, cracks began to show. Their schedules were impossible, their worlds too different. Gere preferred quiet nights and philosophical discussions. Crawford thrived on the energy of the fashion world, on movement and ambition. Their relationship became less about intimacy and more about image, the very thing Gere had always tried to escape. When they divorced in 1995, there were no public outbursts or scandalous revelations, just silence. The same silence that had followed him throughout his life, a shield against a world that always wanted more of him than he was willing to give. For Gere, love was never a publicity stunt. It was something sacred, something to be protected from the glare of cameras. He once admitted that he struggled with the idea of being known, that fame made genuine connection difficult. People didn't meet Richard, they met the idea of him. That quiet isolation would follow him for years, even in moments of triumph. It was a paradox he could never fully escape, adored by millions, yet profoundly alone. After his split from Crawford, Gere's focus shifted. The world saw him less on magazine covers and more in films that reflected an inner maturity. He was no longer chasing romantic leads. He was exploring brokenness, redemption, and silence. In movies like Primal Fear and Autumn in New York, he played men confronting mortality and regret. His acting became deeper, more introspective, more reflective of the man he had become. He no longer seemed interested in charming the audience. Instead, he wanted to make them feel something real. But even as he continued to act, the Hollywood machine began to change. The 1990s saw the rise of flashier, faster storytelling, where subtlety often took a back seat to spectacle. Gere's quiet strength, his deliberate pacing, his thoughtful restraint, all qualities that once set him apart, began to feel out of sync with the times. Younger stars were emerging, and studios were less interested in the kind of nuanced, adult dramas that had made him famous. Still, Gere didn't chase trends. He didn't reinvent himself for the sake of staying relevant. Instead, he retreated into his own world, appearing in fewer films and devoting more time to reflection and personal growth. His next great love would not be with another actress or model, but with something intangible: peace. After years of public attention, Gere began seeking stillness. He traveled, he read, he explored philosophies that helped him make sense of fame's illusions. He wasn't rejecting Hollywood out of bitterness, but out of an understanding that fulfillment couldn't be found on a red carpet. Those who followed his career closely could sense the shift, not in his talent, but in his energy. He seemed lighter, calmer, more detached from the endless noise of the industry. While many assumed his disappearance was sudden, the truth is it was gradual, almost imperceptible. He didn't storm out of Hollywood. He simply drifted away from it, the way an actor steps out of spotlight when the scene ends. To Gere, life was not about the constant need to be seen. It was about learning when to step back, when to listen, and when to let silence speak louder than fame ever could. For years, audiences would wonder why one of the most beloved actors of his generation had vanished so completely. But for Richard Gere, the answer was simple. He had spent decades being everyone else's fantasy. Now, at last, he was ready to live as himself. As Richard Gere moved further from the flashing lights of Hollywood, he began to seek meaning in a world that wasn't scripted, rehearsed, or filmed. For a man who had spent decades performing emotions for millions, the question of what was truly authentic grew increasingly urgent. He had known success in its most dazzling form: the red carpets, the awards, the global recognition. But what fascinated him now was something quieter. He was looking for purpose, for balance, for a life that wasn't defined by public expectation. The man who once embodied the fantasy of cinematic romance was now drawn to something entirely different: a spiritual romance, an awakening that would reshape his identity forever. It began, as all deep transformations do, in solitude. Gere had always been introspective, but during the mid-1990s, that reflection deepened into something profound. Away from the sets and the noise, he began to study, meditate, and connect with philosophies that spoke to his restlessness. He sought understanding not in fame, but in silence. This was not about rejection of success, but about redefining it. He had spent a lifetime being admired for his external grace, and now he wanted to cultivate an inner one. The curiosity that once made him explore human emotion as an actor now turned inward. He had always believed that the soul, like art, needed space to breathe. Hollywood's pace had left little room for that, but Gere found his sanctuary in stillness, in the disciplined pursuit of clarity. He became known among friends and collaborators as someone profoundly centered, calm in a world obsessed with chaos. He practiced meditation daily, a habit that became as essential as breathing. Those who worked with him noticed the shift. He seemed more at peace, less reactive, more present. It wasn't an affectation or a pose. It was genuine transformation. This search for meaning wasn't only personal. It also changed how he approached his craft. Gere's later performances began to reflect an emotional maturity that few actors could reach. He no longer played the charming hero or the tormented lover. He portrayed men who were broken but self-aware, characters searching for truth rather than triumph. In films like The Mothman Prophecies, Arbitrage, and Time Out of Mind, he channeled that quiet struggle into his performances. Audiences could sense the authenticity behind his stillness. He wasn't just acting, he was revealing something raw, something lived. His performances became meditations in themselves, quiet explorations of what it means to lose everything and still find peace. But while his spiritual journey was strengthening, the world around him was changing in ways that tested him deeply. The entertainment industry was shifting towards spectacle and youth, leaving little room for subtlety or contemplation. Gere, who had once defined elegance on screen, suddenly found himself seen as a relic from another era. Studios were chasing franchises, visual effects, and fast-paced storytelling. Gere represented something slower, something deeper, a style of acting that belonged to a time when cinema was about faces, pauses, and meaning. His kind of artistry wasn't easily marketable in a culture addicted to speed. And so, gradually the offer slowed. But rather than lamenting it, Gere accepted it with quiet dignity. He saw it not as rejection, but as a release. The world had changed, and he was no longer trying to keep up with it. He understood that his journey had taken him to a place where fame could no longer feed him. What he needed now was alignment between who he was and what he did. In that sense, his fading from the mainstream wasn't an accident. It was an act of intention. He was no longer interested in playing roles for recognition. He wanted to live roles that reflected his truth. That truth also revealed itself in his relationships. After the high-profile marriage to Cindy Crawford ended, Gere entered a new chapter of his life grounded in simplicity and quiet love. His long relationship with actress Carrie Lowell, which began in the late 1990s, offered him a kind of stability he had never known before. Unlike his previous romances that had played out under constant public scrutiny, this one was mostly private. Together, they built a family and welcomed a son, a moment that, by all accounts, changed him profoundly. Fatherhood gave Gere a renewed sense of purpose. He He often described it as the most humbling role he'd ever played, one that taught him patience, vulnerability, and gratitude. But even that chapter would not be without pain. In 2013, after more than a decade together, Gere and Lowell separated. Their divorce became one of the most discussed celebrity cases in years, not for scandal, but for its scale. The negotiations stretched on, fueled by speculation and sensational headlines. Yet Gere remained composed through it all. He did not lash out, did not perform for the cameras. He once said that peace is not found in avoiding conflict, but in how you respond to it. And in those difficult years, he lived by that philosophy. By the time the divorce was finalized in 2016, Gere was a different man from the one audiences remembered in Pretty Woman. His face had softened with age, his expression calmer, his smile quieter. He no longer sought the validation of crowds. He preferred the company of close friends, his son, and the natural rhythm of a life far removed from Hollywood's noise. He began spending more time outside the United States, finding solace in places where he could walk unnoticed. For a man who had once been chased by paparazzi at every turn, that anonymity was priceless. His disappearance from the mainstream wasn't abrupt. It was a slow, deliberate shedding of everything unnecessary. He gave fewer interviews, accepted fewer roles, and appeared at fewer public events. Those who did encounter him often described him as grounded and warm, but detached from the idea of celebrity. He spoke more about inner peace than ambition, more about gratitude than success. He once said that the most important thing in life is to know when to let go. And that is exactly what he did. He let go of the need to be seen, the need to be relevant, the need to prove anything to anyone. Yet despite his absence, the fascination with Richard Gere never truly disappeared. If anything, it deepened. The less he was seen, the more people wondered about him. In an era where fame is maintained by constant exposure, his silence became its own kind of statement. It was as if he had mastered a lesson most never learn. That presence doesn't always require visibility. He had built a legacy so enduring that even his absence spoke volumes. What made Gere's story so captivating wasn't just his withdrawal from fame, but the grace with which he did it. He didn't fade into bitterness or scandal. He faded into peace. His retreat wasn't a disappearance. It was a homecoming, a return to the values that had shaped him long before Hollywood ever called his name. In a world where everyone is chasing the next spotlight, Richard Gere walked quietly into the shadows, content to live, love, and exist on his own terms. And that choice, more than any role or award, became the final testament to his enigmatic brilliance. By the time Richard Gere entered the later stages of his career, he had already lived several lives. The dreamer from Pennsylvania who left college for the stage. The matinee idol who ruled the 1980s and 1990s with effortless grace. The introspective man who traded glamour for peace. And now, a quiet observer of the world, detached from its noise, but still deeply connected to its humanity. Gere's evolution wasn't just professional. It was spiritual, emotional, and profoundly human. He had reached a point where his fame no longer defined him. What mattered now was how he used his influence, not how brightly it shone. For many years, Gere had balanced two identities, the actor and the advocate. Even at the height of his celebrity, he was drawn to compassion, to helping others, to causes that spoke to universal dignity. He was known to support humanitarian work, focusing on health, education, and relief for those who had no voice. These weren't gestures made for headlines. They were expressions of his inner convictions. Gere had always believed that the truest form of success wasn't measured by applause, but by the good you leave behind. In interviews, he often said that empathy was the highest human art form, and that without it, even the greatest achievements were hollow. That sense of empathy shaped the man he became after fame's spotlight dimmed. While many stars of his era fought to stay relevant, Gere seemed liberated by obscurity. He used his time and resources to support global aid efforts and founded initiatives that promoted compassion and education. People who worked with him in these fields often described him as quiet, hands-on, and deeply involved, not the detached figure one might expect of a celebrity. He didn't arrive with an entourage or cameras. He arrived with focus and sincerity. To those who met him, it was clear he wasn't looking for recognition. He was looking to give something back. Gere's inner peace radiated in the way he carried himself. The sharp edges of youth had softened into calm assurance. His voice, once commanding, became gentler, deliberate, thoughtful. There was no urgency in his words, no need to impress. He seemed to embody a lesson few ever master, the art of stillness. While the entertainment world spun faster than ever, with streaming platforms, viral fame, and constant exposure, Gere represented something timeless. He was a reminder of when artistry meant presence, patience, and grace. To many, he became a living symbol of what it means to age with dignity, to let time refine rather than diminish you. His later film work reflected that same spirit. Gere no longer chased blockbuster scripts or glamorous roles. Instead, he took on projects that carried quiet emotional weight. Films like Arbitrage, Norman, and Time Out of Mind portrayed men confronting moral compromise, loneliness, and redemption. They were not commercial juggernauts, but they were deeply human stories, anchored by the kind of authenticity only lived experience can bring. Critics noted that Gere's acting had become more transparent over time, not in showiness, but in truth. He no longer needed to perform emotion. He had learned to simply feel it and let the audience witness that honesty. Off-screen, his personal life found a new balance. In 2018, Gere married Alejandra Silva, a publicist and activist several decades his junior. What could have been dismissed as another Hollywood headline instead unfolded as a quiet and deeply genuine partnership. Those close to the couple described their relationship as one built on shared values: kindness, spirituality, and family. Together, they welcomed children, and Gere once again embraced fatherhood, this time with the wisdom of experience. He had nothing left to prove, only something to nurture. Family became his sanctuary, a space untouched by the demands of fame. Those who encountered Gere during these years often spoke of his warmth. He wasn't the aloof star people imagined. He was humble, approachable, even playful. He talked about life, gratitude, and the simplicity of everyday joy. He no longer carried the weight of being Richard Gere, movie star. He was simply a man who had learned to live lightly, aware of how fleeting recognition can be and how lasting kindness is. When he appeared at small events or gave rare interviews, his words carried a different tone, not that of a performer, but of a philosopher reflecting on the impermanence of everything that once defined him. And yet, even in his contentment, a quiet sadness lingered in the way the world had moved on without him. The Hollywood system that once celebrated his uniqueness had become colder, more mechanized. Roles for mature, introspective actors were fading. Gere, whose every look and gesture once captivated millions, now stood apart from a culture obsessed with novelty. But if that hurt him, he rarely showed it. His detachment wasn't bitterness, it was acceptance. He had always known fame was temporary, that every golden age eventually ends. What mattered was how gracefully you leave the stage. That grace became his final act. He began appearing less and less, preferring the rhythms of a life far removed from celebrity. Days spent with family, moments of meditation, simple walks in the countryside. Friends said he found beauty in ordinary things, in music, in laughter, in the stillness of early mornings. In a way, he had finally become what he'd always portrayed on screen, a man in search of meaning, now finally at peace with the finding. It's rare for an actor to disappear so completely, yet remain so present in people's memories. But Gere's legacy endures not because of scandal or spectacle, but because of sincerity. He was never the loudest, the flashiest, or the most controversial. He was the one who looked you in the eye and made you believe something real. His quiet withdrawal only deepened that mystique. Fans who grew up watching him still speak of his performances with warmth, of the gentleness he brought to every role. He was proof that masculinity could be tender, that strength could coexist with vulnerability, that love could be portrayed without cynicism. In a world where image often outweighs essence, Richard Gere remains a paradox. A man who walked away from fame not in defeat, but in fulfillment. His life stands as a quiet rebellion against the idea that visibility equals worth. He showed that there is power in restraint, wisdom in silence, and beauty in knowing when to step back. For decades, he was the face of romance on screen. But in the years that followed, he became something far more compelling. A man who found his own kind of peace beyond the applause, beyond the spotlight, beyond the illusion of forever. As the years passed, Richard Gere's distance from Hollywood became less of a mystery and more of a message. The man who once embodied silver screen elegance had chosen a different kind of legacy, one that could not be captured in awards or opening weekend numbers. He had traded the red carpet for quiet country roads, studio lights for morning sunlight, and fame for authenticity. For Gere, the journey wasn't about disappearing, it was about becoming whole again. His life, in many ways, had come full circle, from a young man chasing meaning through art to an artist who finally found meaning beyond art itself. What made Gere's story so fascinating was how gracefully he adapted to each stage of his evolution. He never tried to cling to his past or reinvent himself for the sake of staying relevant. Instead, he allowed time to reshape him. That humility, so rare in a business built on ego, became part of his allure. Even when Hollywood moved on, audiences never forgot him. His films, rewatched and rediscovered by new generations, became timeless touchstones of emotion. Pretty Woman, An Officer and a Gentleman, Days of Heaven, and countless others continued to breathe because Gere's performances had a soulfulness that transcended trends. He wasn't acting to impress, he was acting to connect. In an era of overexposure, Gere's withdrawal only magnified his mystique. The less he appeared, the more curious people became. But he gave the public no spectacle to dissect, no dramatic exit or scandal to fuel gossip. He simply lived quietly, content to be human again. Those who managed to cross paths with him often described the experience as disarmingly normal. He might be walking through a market, sharing a laugh with locals, or sitting quietly in a cafe with his family. No entourage, no bodyguards, no signs of celebrity. Just a man enjoying life at his own pace. That simplicity, after decades of fame, was its own kind of freedom. What Gere discovered was that peace is not a passive state. It's an active choice. To walk away from the spotlight at your peak takes courage. To build a life defined by depth instead of attention takes discipline. Gere had both. He understood that the applause that once fueled him could never fill him. That realization became the cornerstone of his later years. When he did occasionally return a film, it was never out of obligation. It was because something in the story spoke to him on a personal level. He no longer acted for the world, he acted for himself. And that authenticity showed. Even in his 60s and 70s, his screen presence remained magnetic, not because of youth or glamour, but because of the quiet wisdom he carried. Those who have studied Gere's work often point out how his characters mirror his own evolution. Early in his career, he played men consumed by desire and ambition. Later, he portrayed men who had lived long enough to question both. In films like Arbitrage, he played a morally conflicted financier confronting the cost of his choices. In Time Out of Mind, he portrayed a homeless man forgotten by the world. These roles were not glamorous, but they were real. They spoke to the universal truth of impermanence, how easily everything we build can fade, and how meaning can still be found in what remains. In those performances, Gere wasn't chasing stardom. He was exploring humanity. Away from the screen, he continued to live by the same quiet philosophy. He split his time between homes in the United States and Spain, choosing places surrounded by nature and calm. Friends described his life as peaceful, rhythmic, almost meditative. He spent mornings reading or reflecting, afternoons with his children, and evenings in the company of close friends. It was a life rooted in gratitude rather than ambition. And yet, Beneath that tranquility, there was still the glimmer of the artist, an observer of life, always curious, always aware. Gere's family life during these years became his true masterpiece. His marriage to Alejandra Silva grounded him in a way that few could have imagined decades earlier. She was not only his partner, but his equal in kindness and purpose. Together, they devoted time to humanitarian work, supporting shelters, social causes, and charities aimed at improving the lives of those in need. Their connection was not built on fame, but shared compassion. For Gere, this was the final and most profound act of his life story. To use what he had been given for the good of others, and to do it quietly, without seeking credit. That humility extended to his relationship with aging. Unlike many of his contemporaries who fought to hold on to youth, Gere accepted the passing of time with ease. He once said in an interview that every wrinkle tells a story, that growing older is not something to hide from, but to honor. He believed that beauty deepens with age because it becomes inseparable from experience. His silver hair, his calm expression, the softness in his voice, all became symbols of a man at peace with life's impermanence. He wasn't trying to defy time. He was learning to live in harmony with it. And that was perhaps the greatest lesson Richard Gere offered: how to exist in a world that constantly demands noise, yet choose silence instead. His disappearance was not an act of rebellion, but of alignment. He had given the world everything it asked of him: charm, beauty, talent, vulnerability. Now, he was giving himself what he had always needed: stillness. It wasn't a retreat from meaning, but a return to it. The glamour that once defined him had dissolved into something deeper, a quiet radiance that came from within. When fans revisit his old films today, they see more than nostalgia. They see a reflection of his journey. The young man who once embodied the fantasy of romance on screen had, in real life, discovered the truth of love, its patience, its impermanence, its quiet power to heal. His absence from Hollywood wasn't a loss. It was a statement that life, in its purest form, exists beyond performance. And in a way, his vanishing act became the ultimate expression of authenticity. Richard Gere's story is not one of decline. It's one of transcendence. He moved beyond the illusions of fame into a place where success could no longer define him. The man who once represented the ideal of cinematic romance became something far more enduring. A reminder that the truest kind of happiness comes not from being adored, but from being at peace. And in that choice, to live rather than perform, he achieved something that most never will: a life that belongs entirely to him. In the end, Richard Gere's legacy isn't measured in box office numbers or red carpet appearances. It's measured in the quiet dignity with which he lived his life, the authenticity he brought to every role, and the compassion he extended beyond the screen. To watch him now, gray-haired, serene, unbothered by fame, is to witness a man who has truly understood what matters. His journey from restless heartthrob to spiritual humanitarian reflects not just the arc of a career, but the arc of a human being learning, evolving, and ultimately finding peace. Even today, when his name trends online or a clip from Pretty Woman resurfaces, there's a sense of reverence rather than nostalgia. People don't just remember Richard Gere, they feel him. The empathy he carried through his performances lingers long after the credits roll. He didn't simply play lovers or heroes. He embodied the inner struggle to be good, to be present, to be real. And in a world obsessed with illusion, that sincerity became radical. When he appears now, at a charity event, a film festival, or a quiet interview, he radiates that rare kind of calm that can't be faked. There's a centeredness in him, a peace that feels earned. He speaks softly, but every word seems to come from reflection rather than routine. He no longer needs to convince anyone of his worth. The applause has faded, but what remains is far more powerful: respect. Perhaps that's the most poetic ending of all. Richard Gere didn't vanish. He transformed. He slipped out of the Hollywood machine not in defeat, but in grace. He left behind the illusion of eternal youth and embraced the truth of being human, aging, evolving, loving, giving. His story reminds us that sometimes the most profound performances happen off-screen. The curtain doesn't always fall with finality. Sometimes it just opens to a quieter, truer act of life. And somewhere, far from the cameras, maybe he still sits with that same gentle half-smile that once melted the world, content not to be seen, but to be.